You want to know the strangest thing about that afternoon? It was boring, right up until it wasn't. I keep coming back to that. People always think these moments arrive with thunder, like the sky knows something is coming. It doesn't. The sky over London that day was that flat, milky gray it gets in late summer, the kind that can't decide if it wants to rain or just sit there sulking. And the heat. God, the heat. Nobody tells you London can be muggy. You picture fog and umbrellas. You don't picture standing on hot pavement with your shirt sticking to your back, fanning yourself with a tourist map you can't even read properly. That was me. 26 years old, jet-lagged, sunburnt on the back of my neck because I'd forgotten that gray skis still burn you, and standing in a crowd outside the gates of Buckingham Palace with about 400 other people who all had the exact same idea I did. My name's Daniel, by the way. I'd come over for a cousin's wedding up in Manchester, and I'd given myself 3 days in London before the flight home. 3 days to do all the things you're supposed to do. The Eye, the Tower, and of course the Palace, because what kind of idiot flies all that way and doesn't go stare at the most famous house in the world? So there I was, around 2:30 in the afternoon, waiting. Let me set it for you properly, because the place matters. It always matters. The crowd was thick along the black railings, 3 or 4 people deep in some spots. Tourists mostly. You could tell where everyone was from without hearing a word, just by the way they dressed. The Americans in their bright trainers. A group of school kids in matching yellow caps, their teacher counting heads over and over like she'd lose one if she blinked. A couple next to me speaking Italian, the woman laughing at something, the man holding his phone up over the railing trying to get a clean shot through the bars. There was an old man with a little folding stool. I remember him because he'd clearly done this before. He sat down, calm as anything, while everyone around him fought for a view, like he knew something the rest of us didn't. And the pigeons. There are always pigeons. Fat, fearless London pigeons, walking between feet, pecking at dropped crisps, completely unbothered by the fact that they were standing outside a palace. You could hear the city behind us, the low rumble of traffic around the roundabout, a bus hissing as it stopped. Somewhere off to the left, a busker was murdering an Oasis song on an acoustic guitar, and somehow even that felt right. London noise, comfortable noise. And then there was him. The guard. You've seen the pictures. Everybody's seen the pictures. The tall black bearskin hat. The red tunic so red it almost hurts in the right light. The black trousers, the polished boots, the rifle held just so. He was standing in his box, then he wasn't, doing one of those slow ceremonial walks they do, that crisp turn, the stamp of the boot that you feel in your chest more than here. People love watching them. You know why? Because they don't move. Not really. You can wave, you can shout, you can pull the dumbest face you've ever pulled in your life, and they will look straight through you like you're made of glass. There's something almost unsettling about it. This living person, this young man, standing there like a statue while the whole world buzzes around him. I watched a kid try to make him laugh. Couldn't have been more than 7, gap in his front teeth, doing a little dance and going ooga ooga or some nonsense right at the railing. His mum was mortified, trying to pull him back. The guard didn't even blink. Eyes forward, jaw set, like the kid wasn't even there. And I remember thinking, I actually thought this, what a strange job, to stand still while the world stares at you. I had no idea. I genuinely had no idea what that stillness was for. Now here's where it starts to turn. And I want to be honest with you, because the whole reason I tell this story properly is that I owe it to that man to get the details right. So I'm not going to dress it up. I'm just going to tell you what happened, the way it happened, in the order it happened. It started with a feeling, before anything visible. You ever get that? That little drop in your stomach when something's off but your brain hasn't caught up yet. It came from my left, a sort of ripple in the crowd. Not panic, not yet, just a shift, people turning. A small space opening up where a moment ago there'd been none, and you don't realize how unusual that is until you see it, because crowds don't make space. Crowds fill space. Crowds close in. This crowd was peeling back. I turned to look, and at first I couldn't work out what I was seeing. There was a man pushing through. Maybe 40, maybe a bit younger, it was hard to tell. He had a gray hooded top on, zipped halfway, hood down. Thin. The kind of thin that doesn't look healthy. His face was pale and slick with sweat, more than the heat could explain, and his eyes were doing this fast darting thing, left, right, left, never settling on anything. He was moving wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. Everyone else was loose, relaxed, sightseeing. He was wound up tight, like a wire pulled to snapping. His shoulders were up by his ears. He kept looking back over his shoulder at something or someone behind him in the crowd. The Italian woman next to me stopped laughing. I felt her go still. The man pushed right up to the front railing, not far from where the guard was posted. And he stood there breathing hard, hands jammed into the front pocket of his hoodie, and he stared at that palace like it owed him something. A few people gave him room out of politeness. You know, that very English thing of pretending you haven't noticed someone behaving oddly. Eyes down, pretend it's normal, move along. I almost did the same. And then I heard it, off in the distance, faint but climbing. A siren, then another layered underneath it. Police sirens, the proper urgent ones, getting louder, which meant they were getting closer. The man in the gray hoodie heard them too. I watched his head snap up. I watched the panic flood his face like water filling a cup. That's when I understood the looking over the shoulder. He wasn't watching the crowd. He was running from it. I want you to picture the geometry of this, because it's important. In front of us, the railings. Beyond the railings, the wide forecourt of the palace, all that empty space, gravel and stone. The guard standing his post a little way along near his sentry box. To my left, the cornered man. Behind all of us, the open road, the monument, and the sirens getting louder by the second. The man turned, properly turned, away from the palace, facing back into the crowd, back toward the sound of the sirens, and his hand came out of his pocket. I didn't understand what I was looking at. I think part of my brain refused to. You see a thing like that in films, not 3 meters from your own face while you're holding a melting cone of ice cream you bought for $5. It was a handgun, small, dark, ugly. He held it low at first, almost like he was hiding it even while he was holding it, and then he raised it, and he turned in a slow half circle, and the whole crowd just folded. I've never heard a sound like it. It wasn't one scream. It was 400 people all making a noise at once, that high, ragged intake of breath, and then bodies moving, everyone trying to be somewhere they weren't. The old man's folding stool went over. The yellow-capped school kids, I'll never forget this, their teacher threw her arms out wide and herded them backward in one motion, like a hen with chicks, putting her own body between them and the gun without a second's hesitation. People do incredible things in those split seconds. You find out what they're made of. I went down. I won't pretend I was brave. My legs just went, and I half crouched, half fell against the railing, ice cream gone, somebody's elbow catching me in the ribs. And through the gap between bodies, low, from where I dropped, I had a perfect line of sight. The man with the gun, the empty space he'd cleared around himself by holding it, and past him, still and red and impossibly calm. The guard. He hadn't moved. I mean it. 400 people were scrambling for their lives, the air was full of screaming, sirens were closing in from 2 directions, and this young man in the bearskin hat stood there at his post like nothing had changed at all. Eyes forward, rifle held, boots together. For one absurd second I thought, he doesn't know, he can't see it, he's facing the wrong way. But he could see it. Of course he could. They trained them to see everything while appearing to see nothing. He'd probably clocked the man in the gray hoodie before any of the rest of us had. The gunman saw him too. And something about that stillness, about this one figure who refused to run, refused to flinch, refused to give him the fear that everybody else was pouring out. Something about it pulled at him like a magnet. He turned slowly, and he pointed the gun at the guard. I need you to understand the silence that came next because the screaming actually stopped. Not all at once. It sort of drained away, person by person, as more and more of us realized what we were looking at, until there was this awful held breath quiet over the whole front of the palace. The busker had stopped playing. Even the pigeons had gone. Just the sirens. And the gunman's breathing, which I could hear now, ragged and wet because I was close enough. He was maybe 10 feet from the railing. The guard was on the other side of it, a few feet beyond on palace ground. The gun was up, arm shaking, pointed straight at that red tunic at the center of a man's chest. "Don't," somebody whispered behind me, just that. "Don't." The gunman started talking. His voice was high and cracked and the words came out in a tumble. Half of them I couldn't catch, but I caught enough. He kept saying he wasn't going back. "I'm not going back. You hear me? I'm not going back inside." He said something about being set up. Something about a name, a man's name that I didn't recognize. His eyes were wet now, not just with sweat, and his whole body was trembling like he had a fever. A wanted man, cornered, out of road, with sirens behind him and a gun in his hand and absolutely nothing left to lose. That's the most dangerous thing in the world. Not a calm man with a plan. A terrified man with no plan at all. And he was pointing it at someone who would not move. I keep coming back to the guard's face. I had that clear line of sight, remember, low down through the gap in the crowd, and I could see him in profile. He was young, younger than I'd assumed from a distance. There was the faintest sheen on his jaw, and I realized it was sweat, because of course it was, of course he was sweating. He was a human being with a gun pointed at his heart. And somewhere under all that ceremony and discipline his body knew exactly what was happening. But his eyes didn't move. His hands didn't shake. His breathing, I couldn't even see his chest rise. He just stood there, steady, holding the whole moment in place by refusing to break it. "Say something," the gunman shouted suddenly, and his voice cracked clean in half. "Say something, move, do something, you say something." And I understood, watching it, that the guard's stillness was driving him mad. He'd expected fear. He'd built his whole desperate stand on the idea that he could make everyone as afraid as he was. And here was one man who simply would not give it to him, would not run, would not beg, would not even look at him. The gunman took a step forward. The crowd flinched as one body. "I'll do it," he said, quieter now, which was somehow worse. "I swear to God I'll do it. I've got nothing, you hear me? I've got nothing." And in the distance, the sirens stopped. Which meant the cars had arrived. Which meant whatever was going to happen now. I gripped the cold metal of the railing so hard my knuckles ached. The Italian woman beside me had both hands over her mouth. The little gap-toothed boy who danced for the guard was somewhere behind me, and I could hear him crying. One thin, frightened sound, "Mummy, Mummy," and his mother's voice low and shaking, telling him to be quiet, telling him it was going to be okay, telling him a thing she couldn't possibly know was true. The gunman's finger was on the trigger. I could see it, white at the knuckle. The guard breathed in once, slow. I saw it finally, the smallest rise of that red tunic. And what happened next is the part nobody believes when I tell it. Here's the thing about what happened next. I've told this story maybe 100 times now. To family, to friends, to strangers in pubs who don't believe a word of it. And every single time when I get to this point, I have to stop. Because no matter how many times I run it back in my head, it still doesn't feel real. But it happened. I was there. I'll swear to it on anything you like. The guard moved. Not a flinch. Not a stumble. Not the jerky, panicked motion of a man trying to save his own life. It was the opposite of that. It was controlled. It was trained. It was, I swear to you, almost beautiful in the way that something can be beautiful and terrifying at the exact same moment. In one motion he stamped, turned, and brought that rifle down off his shoulder and across his body. And his voice, I'd never heard him make a sound until then. I'd half forgotten he could. His voice came out like a crack of thunder off the palace stone. "Stand back." It wasn't loud the way a scream is loud. It was loud the way an order is loud. It came from somewhere deep in his chest, and it filled the whole forecourt, and it hit the gunman like a physical thing. The man actually rocked backward on his heels. And here's what I understood in that half a second. He wasn't shouting at the gunman to threaten him. He was shouting at us. He was clearing the ground. He was getting the people behind that gunman, the people who'd frozen, the ones still close, out of the line of fire. With one word, he moved a crowd. People scrambled. The little boy was scooped up, bodies flattened against the railings to either side. For one heartbeat, the gunman was alone in his cleared circle, gun still raised, and the guard was facing him full on now, rifle across his body. And the two of them just stared at each other across the railing and the gravel. I remember thinking the guard was going to fire. I braced for it. I think everyone did. He didn't. This is the part that taught me something I've carried ever since. A lesser man would have fired. A frightened man would have. And nobody would have blamed him. Armed suspect, gun raised, civilians everywhere, a wanted fugitive making threats. By any measure, he'd have been within his rights. But he didn't. Because firing meant a gunfight. Firing meant a panicked man with his finger already on the trigger in a crowd of 400 people with school kids 10 feet away. The guard knew that. In a fraction of a second, with a gun pointed at his own chest, that young man did the maths that none of the rest of us could even have started. He held. And then he did the most extraordinary thing. He spoke again, and this time his voice was different, lower, level, almost, and I know how this sounds, almost gentle. "Put it down," he said. The gunman's arm was shaking so badly now I could see the barrel wobble. "I can't," he said. I can't go back." "Put it down," the guard said again, same flat calm. He didn't move the rifle, he didn't advance. He just held his ground, this immovable point of stillness in all that chaos, and he kept his eyes locked on the other man's eyes, not the gun, the eyes. "Nobody's been hurt. You hear me? Nobody's been hurt yet. That can stay true." I've thought about those words 1,000 times. That can stay true. Where does a young man find words like that in a moment like that? They don't teach you that on a parade ground. That came from somewhere else. That came from whatever he was made of. The gunman started crying. Properly crying now, his face crumpling, the gun still up but his whole body sagging like the strings had been cut. "You don't know what they'll do to me," he said. "I don't," the guard agreed, calm, steady. "But I know what happens if you don't put it down, and so do you. Look around you." He didn't take his eyes off the man. But the man looked. He looked at the railings, at the faces, at the school kids in their yellow caps pressed against their teacher, at the old man on the ground, at the little boy with his face buried in his mother's shoulder. I watched something break in him, or maybe something mend, I don't know which. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because while all this was happening, while that quiet, impossible conversation was unfolding across a strip of gravel, the rest of the world had not stopped. The police had arrived. I became aware of them at the edges, movement coming in fast from both sides. Armed officers, dark uniforms, the real ones, the ones with the proper weapons and the helmets, fanning out along the road behind the gunmen, taking positions, moving with that low, fast crouch you see in the films. There were a lot of them. More kept coming. And here's the awful tension of it. The gunman didn't know they were there yet. He had his back to them. All his focus was on the guard, this red figure who would not break, and behind him, closing and silent, was the thing he was most afraid of in the world. If he turned and saw them, he might panic. If he panicked, he might fire, and if he fired. One of the armed officers had a clear shot. I could see it. He was down on one knee, maybe 40 feet back, weapon up, and he was waiting on a command. You could feel it. That whole line of officers was a held breath waiting on a word. The guard could see them too, Of course he could see everything. And what he did then, I still don't fully understand how he had the presence of mind. What he did was, very slightly, almost imperceptibly, he shook his head. Not at the gunman, over the gunman's shoulder, at the police. Hold. He was buying time. He was the only person in that whole tableau the gunman trusted enough to keep looking at, and he was using every second of it to keep the man calm, to keep his back turned, to keep his finger from twitching, while the situation got contained around him. I didn't piece all that together in the moment. In the moment I just watched, frozen, my heart going so hard I could feel it in my teeth. It was afterward, lying awake in my hotel that night and 100 nights since, that I worked out what I'd actually seen. I'd seen a 20-something-year-old kid, in a fancy hat, run the most dangerous negotiation of his life with nothing but his voice and his nerve. "What's your name?" the guard asked. The question seemed to catch the gunman off guard. He blinked. "What?" "Your name, what is it?" A long pause, the arm trembling. The siren silent now, the whole world holding still. "Merk," the man said, barely a whisper. I don't know if that was his real name. I don't suppose it matters now. But the guard nodded, slow, like the name meant something to him, like Merk was a person and not just a threat. "Merk," he said, "I'm not going anywhere, you understand. I'm right here. I'm not going to move, but I need you to lower that, slowly, down to the ground, and then it's over. The worst part's over and you've hurt nobody, and that's going to matter. Trust me. That's going to matter more than you can think right now. They'll put me away forever." "Maybe," the guard said, and I think his honesty was the thing that did it. He didn't lie. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He just said, "Maybe, but you'll be alive to argue it. Everyone here will be. That's the only thing I care about right now. That's the only thing you should care about either." Merk's face was a ruin. Tears and sweat and something else, something I can only call relief and despair tangled up together. The gun came down. An inch, 2 inches. And then, and I felt the whole crowd lean into it, it dropped lower and lower, the barrel pointing at the gravel now, his arm hanging, and you could see he'd given up. You could see the fight go out of him like air out of a tire. "That's it," the guard said softly. "That's it, Merk, all the way down, set it on the ground." And that's when it nearly went wrong. Because that's when Merk heard the police behind him. Maybe one of them shifted. Maybe a radio crackled. I don't know what it was. But something made him jerk his head around, and he saw them, saw the whole line of armed officers, saw the weapons trained on his back, saw the trap closed around him. And the panic came roaring back into his face all at once, and his arm started to come up again. I want you to understand how fast this was. This was less than a second. This was the difference between everybody going home and a massacre on the forecourt of Buckingham Palace. The armed officer with the clear shot had his finger on the trigger. I'm certain of it. The order was a syllable away. And the guard dropped his rifle slightly and raised one white-gloved hand toward the police. Open palm. Hold, hold, hold. And with the other voice, the gentle one, fast now but still level, still impossibly steady, he said, "Merk, Merk, look at me, don't look at them, look at me, I'm still here. Nothing's changed. You're nearly done. You're so nearly done, don't throw it away now. Look at me." And Merk looked at him. God knows why. God knows what it was about that red figure that pulled him back from the edge one more time. Maybe it was the only steady thing in his whole spinning world. Maybe when everything else was pointing a gun at him, the one man who'd offered him a name and a way out was worth looking at. He looked at the guard, and the guard held his eyes, and the moment stretched out and stretched, the longest moment of my entire life, and then Merk crouched, slow, shaking, and he set the gun down on the gravel, and he put his hands up empty over his head, and he started to sob, this broken sound, kneeling there on the ground in front of the palace with his hands in the air. What happened then happened fast. The armed officers were on him in a wave. They came in low and hard, and they had him face down on the gravel and cuffed before I'd even properly understood that it was over. There was shouting now, but it was a different kind of shouting. The controlled, aggressive bark of police taking control of a scene. Don't move, hands, hands, stay down, and Merrick didn't resist. He'd nothing left to resist with. He just lay there and let it happen. The gun was kicked away, secured, somebody in gloves bagging it. And the crowd let out this enormous shuddering breath, 400 people exhaling at once, and then the noise came back all in a rush. People crying, people talking too loud and too fast the way you do when your body's still full of adrenaline and nowhere for it to go. The Italian woman beside me was shaking. The old man was being helped up off the ground, his folding stool retrieved by a stranger. The little gap-toothed boy was wailing into his mother's neck, and she was just holding him, rocking him, her own face wet, saying, "It's over, baby, it's over. It's all over now." I realized I was on the ground. I don't remember sitting down. My legs simply weren't holding me anymore. And through all of it, through the chaos and the noise and the relief crashing over everyone like a wave, the guard stood up straight again. He shouldered his rifle. He stepped back. He turned, crisp and clean, boots together, and he walked the few measured steps back to his post. And he resumed his stance, eyes forward, jaw set, still as a statue. Like nothing had happened at all. I don't think I'll ever get over that last part, the way he just went back. I sat on that pavement and I stared at him. Everyone did. The whole crowd, slowly turning from the arrest happening on the gravel to the red figure who talked a man off the edge of doing something unthinkable, and who was now standing in his box like it was the most ordinary Tuesday in the world. A man near me said it out loud, what we were all thinking. He's just going back to it. He's just standing there. And he was, because that was the job. That was the whole thing I'd failed to understand when I'd watched the little boy dance for him an hour earlier and thought, what a strange job, to stand still while the world stares. The standing still wasn't the absence of action. The standing still was the action. It was discipline. It was readiness. It was a man holding himself in perfect control so that when the world fell apart in front of him, he didn't fall apart with it. All that stillness, all those hours and weeks and months of standing in a box being mocked and photographed and ignored, it had been building toward exactly that. The ability to not break when breaking would get people killed. I'd thought it was a performance. It was a promise. The aftermath went on for a long time. These things always do, I learned. The films cut away after the climax, but real life doesn't have the decency. The forecourt and the road got sealed off. They moved us all back, behind tape, and there was a long, messy stretch of standing around being told nothing while officers did whatever officers do. Merrick was put into a van. I saw him led past, hunched, cuffed, a blanket over his shoulders for some reason, looking smaller than he had with the gun, looking like exactly what he was, which was a frightened, finished man. I heard things later in pieces. From the news, from people who claimed to know, from the great machine of rumor that starts up after a thing like that. They said he was wanted in connection with something serious. They said he'd been on the run for days. They said he'd come to the palace either because he'd cracked completely and didn't know where else to go, or because some broken part of him wanted to make a scene at the most watched place in the country before the end. I don't know which is true. Maybe both. Maybe neither. I do know this. Nobody died that day. Nobody was even hurt. In a situation that had every single ingredient for a catastrophe, a cornered fugitive, a loaded gun, a packed crowd, children. An armed police response. Not one person was harmed. And the reason for that, the entire reason, was a young man who decided that the most important thing he could do with a gun pointed at his heart was not pull his trigger. They tried to talk to him afterward. The press, I mean. Of course they did. It was the story of the week. Hero Guard, all the front pages. They wanted his name, his face, his words. He didn't give them. He couldn't, I think. There are rules about that sort of thing. The guards aren't really meant to become individuals in the public eye. He went back to barracks and back to anonymity, and as far as I know, he never said a public word about any of it. The thing he did, the most remarkable thing I have ever seen a human being do, and he just folded it away and carried on. I've thought about that a lot. We live in a time when people will do almost anything to be seen, when the smallest good deed gets filmed and posted and milked for every drop of attention it's worth. And here was a man who did something genuinely extraordinary, something that saved God knows how many lives, and his reward, his entire reward, was to go back to standing in a box being ignored. He didn't do it to be seen. That's the whole point. He did it because it was the job, and the job mattered more than he did. I don't know if I've ever met anyone who could say that and mean it. I'm not sure I could. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my hotel room, this cheap little room near Victoria with a window that didn't quite close, and I listened to London going about its business below me, oblivious, and I shook. Just shook on and off for hours. The adrenaline finds its way out eventually. Mine came out as the shakes, and a few tears I wasn't expecting, and this strange, hollow gratitude that I didn't have words for. I kept seeing it, the gun coming up, the crowd folding, the guard not moving, stand back, the little shake of his head at the police, hold, the gentleness in his voice. Merk, look at me. The gun coming down, and then after all of it, the best part, the crisp turn, the steady boots, the return to the post, like he was simply picking up where the day's strangeness had interrupted him. I flew home 2 days later. I went back to my ordinary life, my ordinary job, the cousins' wedding photos coming through on the family group chat, everyone asking how London was. And I'd say amazing, and you wouldn't believe it, and most of the time I'd leave it there, because how do you actually explain a thing like that over a text message? But it changed me. I won't pretend it didn't. I notice things differently now. I notice the people who hold steady when everything's coming apart, the nurse, the teacher, the bloke who just quietly does the right thing when nobody's filming. I used to think bravery was loud. The big gesture, the war cry, the running into fire, and sometimes it is. But the bravest thing I ever saw was a man standing perfectly still. I went back years later, not on purpose exactly. Work took me to London again, and I had an afternoon free, and my feet just sort of carried me there, back to those black railings, back to the gravel forecourt that had been the worst and most important minutes of my life. It was different, sunnier, a new crowd, none of whom had any idea, new tourists in new bright trainers, a new busker, new fat fearless pigeons, and a guard, not the same one, I'm sure. It had been too long, standing his post in his red tunic and his bearskin hat, eyes forward, jaw set, still as stone, while a small girl in front of him pulled a silly face and her dad laughed and took a photo. And I stood at the railing for a long time, and I just watched him. Everyone else saw a statue, a photo opportunity, a bit of pageantry, a tradition, a man in a funny hat who wasn't allowed to smile. I saw something else. I saw all that stillness, and I knew, the way most of those tourists would never know, exactly what it was holding inside it. I knew what that calm was for. I knew that under the discipline and the ceremony was a young man who had been trained and trusted to be the thing that doesn't break when the world does. I didn't say anything. You don't. You can't. He wouldn't have looked at me anyway, eyes forward, always forward. But before I left, I stood square in front of him and I nodded, just once. A small thing. A thank you he'd never know was for him, for a man he'd probably never met, for a day he probably knew nothing about. And then I walked back out into the noise of London, into the ordinary afternoon, with the pigeons and the buses and the busker. And I thought about how the most important moments of our lives can happen in the most ordinary places, on the most ordinary days, under a flat gray sky that can't decide whether to rain. Most people walk past those railings and see a man who isn't allowed to move. I'll always see the man who, when it mattered most, didn't. And that's the part I still can't quite believe. Not the gun, not the fugitive, Not the sirens or the screaming or the long, terrible seconds where the whole world held its breath. It's that he just stood there. And by standing there, he saved us all.